It was Christmas Eve, 2021, and my fiancée, Hannah, and I were staying at a rental cabin in a remote area of Montana. We'd been planning this trip for months, eager to escape the city and enjoy a quiet, snow-covered holiday together. The cabin was perfect, small, cozy, and surrounded by a pristine forest that looked like it belonged on a holiday card. We arrived just before sunset and quickly unloaded our car, eager to get settled before the temperature dropped even further. The cabin had a rustic charm, with wooden beams, a stone fireplace, and a lofted bedroom. There was no Wi-Fi, which we didn't mind, but the cell service was spotty, something that made me feel uneasy even though I didn't want to admit it. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the snow began to fall, soft and steady at first, but soon turning into a heavy storm. We made dinner, poured ourselves some wine, and sat by the fire, exchanging small gifts. It was idyllic, everything we'd hoped for. But as the night wore on, a creeping sense of unease began to settle over me. I chalked it up to the isolation. It was so quiet, you could hear the snowflakes hitting the windows. Around 11 p.m., we decided to head to bed. The lofted bedroom had a single window that looked out over the forest, and as we climbed under the thick blankets, Hannah teased me for peeking out of it so often. "What are you looking for?" she asked, laughing. I shrugged it off, muttering something about the storm. In truth, I wasn't sure what I was expecting to see. Maybe a deer or some other wildlife. But the darkness beyond the window felt oppressive, as if something was lurking just out of sight. I woke up a few hours later to a noise. It was faint at first, like the sound of snow sliding off the roof, but it grew louder and more deliberate. Thump, thump, thump. It was coming from the porch. I held my breath, straining to listen, but the sound stopped just as suddenly as it had started. I glanced at Hannah, still fast asleep, and debated whether to check it out. Grabbing my phone for light, I crept down the ladder and peered out the living room window. At first, I saw nothing but swirling snow, but then my eyes adjusted and I noticed something. Footprints leading up to the cabin. They were large, too large to belong to any animal I knew, and they stopped just short of the front door. I locked the door and checked the windows, making sure everything was secure. The fire had burned down to embers, casting long shadows across the room, and I felt a sudden urge to turn on every light in the cabin. But I didn't want to wake Hannah, so I settled for grabbing the hatchet we brought for chopping wood and bringing it upstairs with me. The next morning, the storm had eased, leaving a thick blanket of snow over the landscape. I decided not to tell Hannah about the footprints, not wanting to ruin the holiday, but I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that someone, or something, had been outside during the night. As we ate breakfast, Hannah mentioned that she'd had trouble sleeping. "I kept hearing noises," she said, stirring her coffee. "It sounded like whispering." She laughed nervously, clearly trying to brush it off, but I could see the unease in her eyes. We decided to spend the day hiking through the woods near the cabin. The fresh snow made everything look magical, and for a while, I managed to forget about the strange events of the night before. But as we made our way back to the cabin, I noticed something that made my stomach drop. More footprints, circling the cabin. They were identical to the ones I'd seen earlier, and this time, there were more of them, as if someone had been pacing around the house. I pointed them out to Hannah, who immediately wanted to leave. I agreed, but the storm had left the narrow dirt road leading to the cabin impassable. We'd have to wait until the snowplow came through the following morning. We locked the doors, drew the curtains, and decided to stay in the living room together, the hatchet and a kitchen knife within arm's reach. As night fell, the noises started again. At first, it was just the wind rattling the windows, but then came the thumping, louder and more insistent than before. This time, it was accompanied by scratching, as if someone, or something, was trying to claw its way inside. Hannah was visibly terrified, clutching her knees to her chest as I held the hatchet, my heart pounding. Suddenly, the power went out, plunging the cabin into darkness. I turned on my phone's flashlight and shone it toward the front door, just in time to see the handle jiggle. Someone was trying to get in. "Who's there?" I shouted, my voice trembling. There was no response, just the sound of heavy breathing on the other side of the door. I backed away, pulling Hannah with me, as the door shook violently in its frame. Then, Just as suddenly as it had started, the noise stopped. We held our breath, listening, but the only sound was the wind outside. After what felt like an eternity, the power came back on, and we saw something that made my blood run cold. Nailed to the door was a piece of wood, roughly carved into the shape of a human figure. Around its neck was a piece of red string, tied in a tight knot. We didn't sleep that night. At first light, we packed our things, cleared as much snow as we could from the road, and left. As we drove away, I looked back at the cabin one last time. Standing at the edge of the woods was a figure, tall and thin, watching us go. I don't know who or what it was, but I know I'll never spend another Christmas in the middle of nowhere again. GPT icon. Here's story 5. In December 2016, my brother Ryan and I decided to spend Christmas at our grandparents' old farmhouse. It had been in the family for decades, but after our grandparents passed, the house sat empty, slowly falling into disrepair. My parents had been talking about selling it, but Ryan and I thought spending one last Christmas there would be a good way to honor the memories we had growing up. The farmhouse was tucked away in rural Pennsylvania, surrounded by miles of fields and dense woods. The nearest neighbor was half a mile down the road, and the small town was a 20-minute drive away. It was the kind of place that felt isolated even during the day. At night, it was pitch black, with only the sound of the wind whistling through the trees. We arrived on Christmas Eve, just before a snowstorm rolled in. The house was freezing, and the smell of must and dust lingered in the air. The power still worked, but it flickered every so often, and the heater groaned like it was struggling to stay alive. We made a fire in the old brick fireplace and tried to make the place feel festive, even hanging some string lights we brought along. As the storm picked up outside, we settled in, reminiscing about the Christmases we'd spent here as kids. Ryan told me he used to be terrified of the basement, convinced he'd seen a face staring up at him from the small window at ground level. I laughed it off, but I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that had crept over me since we arrived. Around 10 p.m., Ryan went to bed, leaving me alone in the living room. I stayed up reading, the crackling fire the only sound in the house. The storm had turned into a full-blown blizzard, and the wind howled against the windows. I was just starting to nod off when I heard it, a faint knocking sound, coming from the back door. At first, I thought it was just the wind rattling the old wood, but the knocking grew louder and more deliberate. 3 sharp raps, then silence. My heart raced as I grabbed a flashlight and crept toward the door. I shone the beam through the frosted glass but didn't see anyone. Still, the footprints leading up to the door told me I wasn't imagining things. I bolted the door and checked all the locks on the windows and front door. The thought of someone wandering around the farmhouse in the middle of a snowstorm made my skin crawl. I woke Ryan, and together we searched the house, but there was no one inside. We tried to laugh it off, convincing ourselves it was probably a lost traveler who'd moved on. We went back to bed, but sleep didn't come easily. I kept hearing faint noises, creaks, taps, and what sounded like faint whispers. Around 3 a.m., I woke up to the sound of shattering glass. I jumped out of bed, grabbing the baseball bat Ryan had brought with him, and ran to the kitchen. The window above the sink was broken, shards of glass scattered across the counter. Snow swirled through the open space and on the windowsill. I saw something that made my stomach drop, a single, bloody handprint. It wasn't smudged, as if someone had accidentally touched the glass. It was deliberate, pressed firmly against the wood. Ryan came rushing in, and we immediately called the police. While waiting for them to arrive, we barricaded the doors and huddled in the living room, the bat and a kitchen knife between us. The whispers grew louder, almost like they were coming from the walls themselves. At one point, Ryan swore he saw a shadow move across the hallway, but when we checked, there was nothing there. When the police finally arrived, the noises stopped. They found footprints leading from the broken window to the woods behind the house, but no other evidence. They suggested it might have been a prank or a burglar who got scared off when we turned on the lights. The next morning, we decided to pack up and leave. As we loaded the car, I noticed something sticking out of the snow near the edge of the woods. It was a small wooden ornament, crudely carved into the shape of a person. Carved into its surface was a single word, stay. We didn't. We left and never returned to the farmhouse. My parents sold the property the following spring, and as far as I know, no one has lived there since. But every Christmas, I can't help but think about the knocking, the handprint, and the eerie whispers. Whatever was in that house, it didn't want us to leave. Or maybe it didn't want us to survive. In 2020, my best friend Carla invited me to spend Christmas at her family's cabin deep in the woods of northern Michigan. It was an annual tradition for her family, but this year, due to the pandemic, only she and I would be going. Carla said it would be fun. Just us, a cozy cabin, and a snowstorm rolling in to make it feel like a true winter wonderland. I agreed, thinking it would be a great way to escape the craziness of the year. The cabin was tucked away at the end of a winding, unpaved road, surrounded by towering pine trees. It was picturesque during the day, but eerily quiet at night. When we arrived on Christmas Eve, we were greeted by a thick blanket of snow and the kind of cold that cuts straight through your clothes. Carla had the key, and we quickly unloaded our things, eager to get inside and start a fire. The first few hours were perfect. We cooked dinner, sipped hot chocolate, and played cards by the fireplace. Carla told me stories about past Christmases at the cabin, and I could see why her family loved it so much. But as the night wore on, the storm outside grew more intense. The wind howled, rattling the windows, and the snow piled up against the door. We didn't mind. It just added to the ambience. Around 11 p.m., Carla suggested we call it a night. I agreed, but before heading to bed, I decided to grab some more firewood from the pile outside. The snow was still coming down hard, and the wind made it difficult to see more than a few feet ahead. As I reached the woodpile, I had the strange sensation of being watched. I paused, looking around, but all I saw were trees and snow. I grabbed an armful of wood and started back toward the cabin. That's when I noticed something odd. Footprints in the snow, leading from the tree line to the side of the cabin. They were fresh, too fresh to have been made earlier. My stomach tightened as I realized there were no tracks leading away. I hurried inside, locking the door behind me. Carla was already in bed, so I didn't tell her what I'd seen, not wanting to freak her out. Instead, I stoked the fire, double-checked the locks, and went to my room. But sleep didn't come easily. I kept hearing faint noises, creaks, taps, and what sounded like muffled footsteps on the porch. Around 2 a.m., I was jolted awake by a loud bang, like something had hit the side of the cabin. I grabbed my phone and flashlight, my heart racing, and crept into the living room. The fire had died down, leaving the room dimly lit. Carla was still in her room, the door closed. I hesitated before opening the front door, but the noise had come from outside, and I needed to know what it was. When I stepped onto the porch, the cold hit me like a wall. The snow was deeper now, almost knee-high, and the wind bit at my face. I shone the flashlight around, but nothing seemed out of place, until I noticed something sticking out of the snow by the porch railing. It was a small, crudely carved wooden figurine, about 6 inches tall, resembling a person. Its face was blank, and it had long, thin arms that stretched unnaturally. I picked it up, turning it over in my hands, and noticed something carved into its back. A single word, "Run." I dropped the figurine and bolted back inside, locking the door behind me. My hands were shaking as I woke Carla and told her what I'd found. She looked skeptical at first, but when I showed her the footprints outside and the figurine, her expression changed. She admitted she'd heard her parents talk about strange occurrences at the cabin before, but she always thought they were just trying to scare her. We decided to stay in the living room together, keeping the fire going and waiting for sunrise. But the night wasn't over yet. Around 4 a.m., we heard it, scratching at the back door. It was faint at first, almost like a tree branch brushing against the wood. But then it grew louder, more deliberate. Carla grabbed a fire poker, and I held the flashlight, both of us frozen in fear. The scratching stopped, replaced by heavy, deliberate knocks. Whoever, or whatever, was outside wanted us to know they were there. Carla whispered for me to check the front door while she stayed near the back. I crept to the front window, peeking out through a gap in the curtains, and my blood ran cold. There, standing in the snow just beyond the porch light, was a figure. It was tall and thin, its face obscured by the shadows, but it wasn't moving. It just stood there, staring at the cabin. I ran back to Carla, whispering what I'd seen. We debated what to do, call for help or wait it out. But before we could decide, the front door rattled violently, as if someone was trying to force it open. Carla screamed, and I grabbed my phone, dialing 911. The signal was weak, but I managed to get through and explain our situation. The operator told us to stay inside and wait for help. We barricaded the doors with furniture and huddled by the fireplace, clutching the fire poker and flashlight like our lives depended on it. The banging and scratching continued for what felt like hours, but no one ever got inside. When the police arrived at dawn, the noise stopped. They found footprints circling the cabin and leading into the woods, but no sign of anyone. The wooden figurine was gone, and the officers dismissed our story as overactive imaginations. We left that morning and never went back. Carla's family sold the cabin the following year. Every Christmas, I think about that night and the figure in the snow. Whoever, or whatever it was, they wanted us to leave, and I'm just grateful we listened. It was Christmas Eve, 2018, and I had decided to spend it alone in my childhood home. My parents had passed a few years prior, and the house had sat empty since. I hadn't planned on coming back, but something about Christmas made me nostalgic. I wanted to relive some old memories, even if it was just for a night. The house was in a quiet rural area, surrounded by dense woods and a long gravel driveway that felt a mile away from civilization. It was always peaceful growing up, but returning as an adult, the isolation felt more unsettling than comforting. Still, I told myself I was being silly. It was just one night. I arrived around sunset, the sky streaked with orange and purple hues. The house smelled stale, like it had been sealed up for too long. I started a fire in the living room, trying to chase away the chill that seemed to seep from the walls. It wasn't long before the house felt cozy, almost like it used to when I was a kid. I unpacked a few things and set up a small Christmas tree I'd brought with me. It wasn't much, just a tiny plastic tree with a single string of lights, but it made the place feel less empty. I cooked myself a simple dinner and sat by the fire, flipping through an old photo album I'd found in the attic. The pictures brought back a flood of memories: family Christmases, snowball fights in the yard, decorating the tree. It felt bittersweet, but I was glad I'd come back. Around 10 p.m., I decided to head to bed. I turned off the lights, leaving just the soft glow of the Christmas tree to illuminate the living room. As I climbed the stairs, I thought I heard a faint creak behind me, like the sound of a footstep on an old floorboard. I paused, listening, but the house was silent. I chalked it up to the house settling and continued to my old bedroom. The room looked almost the same as I'd left it years ago. The same twin bed, the same faded wallpaper, even the same desk lamp. I climbed into bed, pulling the heavy quilt over me, and stared out the window at the snow-covered yard. It was peaceful, and before long, I drifted off to sleep. I woke up to a sound. At first, I thought it was part of a dream, but then I heard it again. Soft tapping, coming from downstairs. My heart raced as I sat up in bed, straining to listen. The tapping grew louder, more deliberate. It was coming from the living room. I grabbed my phone and turned on the flashlight, creeping down the stairs as quietly as I could. The tapping stopped just as I reached the bottom step. I scanned the living room, the flashlight beam sweeping across the walls and furniture. Everything looked normal, except for one thing. The Christmas tree lights were off. I was certain I'd left them on. I walked over to the tree, my footsteps echoing in the silence. That's when I saw it. On the tree, tied to one of the branches, was a small piece of paper folded neatly. My hands trembled as I opened it. Scrawled in messy handwriting were the words, "I see you." I froze, my mind racing. Who had written it? How had they gotten inside? I looked around the room, half expecting someone to jump out from the shadows, but there was no one there. The front door was locked, the windows were shut, and the house was still. I grabbed a fireplace poker and checked every room, every closet, every corner of the house, but it was empty. The only thing I found was another note, this one taped to the back door. It read, "Don't stay." That was enough for me. I packed my bag as quickly as I could, grabbed my car keys, and headed for the door. As I stepped onto the porch, I noticed something in the snow. Footprints. They weren't mine. They led from the woods to the front door, then back into the trees. I got in my car and drove away, my heart pounding the entire time. I didn't stop until I reached the nearest gas station, where I called the police. They went to check the house but didn't find anything. No notes, no footprints, nothing. It was like it had all disappeared. I haven't been back to that house since. Every Christmas, I think about the notes, the footprints, and the feeling of being watched. I don't know who or what was out there that night, but I do know one thing. I was never alone. In December 2019, my girlfriend Sophie and I rented a small cabin in the mountains of Colorado for a Christmas getaway. We both wanted to escape the city chaos and spend the holiday in peace, surrounded by snow-covered trees and the warmth of a crackling fireplace. It was a dream setting, isolated, serene, and picture-perfect. Or so we thought. We arrived a few days before Christmas, late in the afternoon, with the sun already dipping behind the mountains. The cabin was cozy but rustic, with creaky wooden floors and a chimney that hadn't seen use in years. There was a shed out back, which the property owner told us to avoid because it was old and unstable. I didn't think much of it at the time. The first night was peaceful. We unpacked, cooked dinner, and played cards by the fireplace. The cabin's isolation was refreshing, a welcome break from the noise of the city. But when Sophie went to bed, I stayed up, scrolling through my phone. That's when I heard it, a faint crunching sound outside, like footsteps in the snow. At first, I thought it might be an animal, but the steps were too deliberate, too heavy. I turned off the lights and peeked through the curtains, but I couldn't see anything in the darkness. Telling myself it was nothing, I went to bed. The next morning, I noticed footprints in the snow leading from the edge of the woods to the side of the cabin. They didn't look fresh, but they definitely weren't ours. The tracks circled the cabin and disappeared into the trees. I showed them to Sophie, but she just shrugged it off, saying it was probably a hiker or maybe someone passing through the area. That evening, as the sun set, I went out to gather firewood from the pile near the shed. The snow had started falling again, and the air was eerily quiet. As I approached the shed, I noticed something strange. The door, which had been padlocked when we arrived, was slightly open. Curiosity got the better of me. I shone my flashlight inside, expecting to see old tools or maybe broken furniture. Instead, there was a makeshift bed in the corner, made of tattered blankets and newspapers. Scattered around it were empty cans of food, a few cigarette butts, and a single muddy boot. My stomach churned as I realized someone had been staying here, possibly while we were in the cabin. I locked the shed as best as I could and hurried back inside. I didn't tell Sophie about what I'd found, not wanting to ruin the trip or scare her, but I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that someone might still be around. That night, Sophie woke me up around 3 a.m. She whispered that she heard something outside, soft tapping on the window. I grabbed a flashlight and crept to the living room, my heart pounding. The tapping stopped as I got closer, and when I pulled back the curtain, all I saw was snow falling gently in the moonlight. The next morning, we found something chilling. Small handprints on the window, low to the ground, as if a child had been standing there. But there were no footprints leading up to the window or away from it. It didn't make sense. Sophie wanted to leave, but I convinced her to stay, assuring her it was probably just our imaginations. That evening, we decided to distract ourselves by watching a Christmas movie. Halfway through, the power went out, plunging the cabin into darkness. Sophie grabbed her phone for light while I searched for the backup generator the property owner had mentioned. As I stepped outside to check the generator shed, the snow fell heavier and visibility was almost zero. That's when I saw it, a figure standing at the edge of the woods. It was barely visible through the snow, but I could make out its outline, tall and unmoving. I called out, but it didn't respond. Instead, it slowly stepped back into the trees and disappeared. I ran back inside, locking the door behind me. Sophie was sitting on the couch, clutching her phone, her face pale. She said she'd heard whispering near the back door while I was outside. It wasn't clear words, just soft murmurs, almost like a chant. We decided we'd had enough. Packing up in the middle of a snowstorm wasn't ideal, but staying felt even more dangerous. As we loaded the car, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. Tied to the porch railing was a bundle of twigs wrapped in red string. the same color as the one I'd seen in the shed. Next to it was a note, scrawled in messy handwriting, "You're not safe here." We drove away without looking back, the snow swallowing the cabin behind us. To this day, I have no idea who or what was out there in the woods. Maybe it was just a deranged squatter. Maybe it was something else entirely. All I know is that I'll never spend another Christmas in a remote cabin again. It was December 2017, just a few weeks before Christmas, and my wife and I had recently moved into a small house in the quiet outskirts of a mid-sized town in Vermont. We wanted a slower-paced life away from the chaos of the city, and this house felt perfect, a rustic charm with wooden beams, a stone fireplace, and a beautiful view of the nearby snow-covered hills. It even came with a detached garage that we planned to turn into a workshop someday. The house had been vacant for about a year before we bought it, but it seemed well kept. Our nearest neighbors were a quarter-mile down the road, and the rest of the area was surrounded by dense woods and a winding creek. It felt idyllic at first, but it didn't take long before strange things began to happen. On our first night, as we unpacked, I noticed something odd about the garage. Despite the frigid weather, the padlock on the side door was missing. It swung open slightly, creaking with the icy breeze. I peeked inside but found nothing except an old workbench and some rusty tools left behind by the previous owner. I figured the lock had just been lost or damaged, so I made a mental note to replace it. The next few days passed uneventfully, though I occasionally felt like I was being watched, especially near the garage. My wife, Amanda, laughed it off, saying it was just the eerie silence of the woods playing tricks on me. One evening, after dinner, we decided to take a walk down the snowy road to admire the Christmas lights on a few of the other houses. As we approached a turn, Amanda tugged at my arm and asked if I saw it too, a faint light flickering in the woods. It was distant, maybe 100 yards in, but it moved like someone carrying a flashlight. We watched for a moment, but it disappeared. Thinking it might be a hiker or someone camping, we shrugged it off and headed back home. That night, around 2 a.m., I woke up to the sound of footsteps outside. They were faint but distinct, crunching in the snow. I got out of bed and looked out the window, but all I saw was the glimmer of moonlight on the yard. Amanda stirred and asked what was wrong. I told her I thought I heard someone outside. She groggily suggested it was probably a deer and went back to sleep. The next morning, I found footprints in the snow leading from the garage to the back of the house. They didn't belong to us. They were larger and clearly made by boots. My stomach sank as I followed the trail to the back door, where it stopped abruptly. There were no prints leading away. It was as if whoever it was had vanished. I checked the garage again and found something new. A torn piece of fabric snagged on the workbench. It looked like part of a red jacket, the kind you'd wear in the winter. I didn't tell Amanda about it, not wanting to scare her, but I decided to replace the missing padlock that afternoon. When I went to the hardware store, the clerk asked where I lived, and I casually mentioned the location. His expression changed, and he said, "You bought the old Harlow place?" I nodded, and he chuckled nervously. "You might want to keep an eye on that garage. People around here say it's bad luck." "Bad luck?" I asked, but he just shook his head and muttered, "You'll see." That night, the snowstorm hit. Heavy winds battered the house, and snow piled up against the windows. Amanda and I sat by the fireplace, drinking cocoa and watching Christmas movies. The power flickered a few times, but stayed on. Around 10 p.m., there was a loud bang from outside. It sounded like something had slammed against the garage. Grabbing a flashlight, I went to check. As I approached the garage, I noticed the door was slightly ajar again, despite the new padlock. I shone the flashlight inside and froze. In the corner, barely visible, was a figure hunched over near the workbench. I couldn't make out the details, but it looked like a man wearing a red jacket. "Hey!" I shouted, and the figure bolted towards the woods, disappearing into the darkness. My heart was racing as I locked the garage again and ran back to the house. I told Amanda what I'd seen, and she insisted we call the police. They arrived within half an hour, but the tracks leading into the woods had already been buried by fresh snow. They assured us they'd patrol the area but didn't seem overly concerned. We didn't sleep much that night. I kept the fireplace poker by the bed, and Amanda slept with her phone clutched in her hand. The next morning, we found something disturbing. Hanging from the garage door was a crude wooden cross tied with red string. It swayed gently in the wind, and underneath it was a note scrawled on a piece of old paper: "Not welcome.